I shared this story at a recent Kung Fu Palooza, and then I've been thinking about it, and it would be, I think, a good service to share with anyone who wasn't there, right? Because this comes up from time to time in martial arts and Kung Fu, and people, out of egotism, people compare different things that don't really matter, like different martial arts, different styles, and this and that, and it really, for your purposes of your own development, improving yourself, becoming more fit, becoming sharper in mind, body, and spirit, it's really not that important. Okay, and this is not just me. This goes back to when martial arts was even started. Okay, and now to give you a little bit of context on that, before I go into that, a little history lesson for you. Martial arts. Everyone thinks that a lot of people think that martial arts comes from Shaolin. The Kung Fu started at Shaolin, right? People think that, and then once Shaolin Kung Fu was invented, then other styles, Japanese and Korean styles, kind of branched off of that, right? And that's arguable, but really, I mean, there's evidence of that the martial art from Shaolin came from India and whatever. It's not really important, but when you go way back in time, if you think about it, if you break it down to its basic components, some people have said that martial arts started the day when a hunter took his spear or whatever tool he used for hunting, and he used it against another human, either in attack or defense or whatever reason. On that day when that happened, that's when martial art was born, because you took a skill that was used for killing, for survival, and used it for, well, not killing for survival. Well, maybe survival in a way of like defense, survival that way. But when it's pitted it against another human, that's when it became kind of an art and a science, and it became, man made it more effective, right? So arguably that's where martial art, because martial meaning, like war art, that's where it came from. Now, I disagree with that. I think martial art was invented around the time when Confucius started using archery for self-refinement. Okay, so there's a difference there. There's using this war art for survival, and there's using this war art for refinement and self-cultivation. When that started happening, I would argue that is when our modern martial art was actually created, right? Where it was used as a mental, physical, and spiritual development process. Okay, so if you keep that in mind, this whole idea of like, what system is more effective, who can beat up who, and all that other garbage, this goes back, way back to those days when Confucius was teaching archery as a technique for self-refinement. Because even then, historically, it's written that he had the same issues where people would say, like, if he was teaching people that were maybe not hunters, but maybe they were a smaller frame and didn't really use the techniques for hunting, they would still use it for their own self-cultivation as a practice, right, for focus, like Zen archery, right? And people would criticize him and say, what's the point of, teaching that little person there archery? They can't even pierce the leather. And that would have meant, like, if you can't pierce the leather of a target, there's no point, because you can't use that skill practically for hunting, because you can't pierce the skin of the animal that you're trying to hit anyway. So what's the point? The art doesn't work. And he would argue, well, that's not the point. The point is self-refinement here. So maybe this person doesn't need to hunt, but if they use this in every shot, they're not trying to kill an animal, but they're instead chipping away at a piece of themselves, then they're gradually becoming a more refined person. That was the point, and that's martial art. So, if you're teaching a child that's like, 10 years old, and you're getting them to junior black belt, they'll be pretty proficient, and but they're not going to be able to necessarily defend themselves against a full-grown adult. That doesn't mean that the martial art doesn't work. It's just not practical, right? That they can defend themselves against a full-grown adult. Now, they could equip themselves much better than another person who's not trained so well, just being alert and having a louder voice and kicking in the right spots and running away and that kind of thing. So that can all happen, but it's not about being invulnerable. It's about refining yourself, and that ego stuff eventually washes away. It's kind of funny. That's the martial art paradox right there, is that you start because you want to protect yourself, and then eventually you realize there's no self that needs protecting, right? So in order to protect your ego, you end up realizing that you don't need the ego anyway, and that's the martial paradox there. So anyway, I hope that kind of makes sense to you guys, and I hope that's helpful whenever you think like, well, what about what if someone does this? What if someone does that, right? And you can deal with all those scenarios the best you can, and you can be prepared for them to protect yourself. But ultimately, the real test here is that you're refining your character, and you're learning a lot of the internal development that's not as immediately as tangible and not as immediately visible, but it's there, right? And the Kung Fu process is a lot like bamboo, right? When you plant bamboo, it takes a lot of time for those roots to sink, to dig in the ground. I don't know, what is it? Someone on here can comment and they know. It's like 10 years it takes for bamboo to root. But then once that period where the roots have gone deep, once that happens, the bamboo just shoots up like crazy, right? But you've got to spend a lot of time developing those roots. And when it comes to character development, that's what that's like. You spend a lot of time on on developing your values and understanding them, and then before you know, when they get anchored in, then they really start to come out in your actions when you're going through some kind of adversity or some kind of struggle, right? That's when it really tests what you've been working on. A lot of times you won't know you've been working on these values until you're hit with a tough time or a tough decision, and all of a sudden you look around and you notice you're much more equipped to handle this kind of stress and adversity, because you've got those roots. You spent a lot of time developing those roots. Okay. Anyway, thanks for joining me. Just thought I'd run that by you, and I will hopefully see you soon in class.